Good evening. I'm Stuart Brand from the Long Now Foundation. Matt Ridley is the antidote to, in this book, his book called The Rational Optimist, to what is portrayed in another book I'll recommend to you called The Idea of Decline in Western History and Western Civilization. And for some reason, Western intellectuals keep liking to tell each other that things are going to hell and here's why. And here's who's to blame, and things like that. Here's the antidote, Matt Ridley.
Woody Allen once said that mankind stands at a crossroads. One road leads to despair and total extinction, the other to utter hopelessness. Let us pray we have the wisdom to make the right choice. It's that attitude that, as Stuart has just said, I think is all too prevalent and that I want to try and dissuade you from tonight. Now, it might seem very cheeky for a Brit from gloomy old Europe to come over here to wonderful San Francisco, where you're all so optimistic, and try and teach you optimism. And it actually, to be a little more serious for a second, it might seem cheeky in a week when 20,000 people have died in a disaster to say that the world can get better and that the future can be better than the past. Just two things about Japan, though, that I want to say before I go on. The first is that because Japan was so wealthy, many fewer people died than would have done. If Japan had had the per capita income of Haiti, as we know from the Haitian earthquake recently, something like 300,000 people might have died in collapsed buildings. And if Japan had had the per capita income of Burma, something similar might have happened with the tsunami, because 300,000 people died in a cyclone in Burma recently. So it's the very fact that it had the infrastructure, the communications, the technology, that so many people did not die. And that's what I want to try and talk about tonight. How do we raise human living standards? How do we improve the condition of people on the planet? And can we go on doing it? On my desk at home sits this object. It's an Ashwalian hand axe from 500,000 years ago. It's of a design that was used by Homo erectus for nearly 1 million years, possibly more. It's a beautiful technology, and it is a technology. But it didn't change. It was used all over the world, and it didn't change for 1 million years. That's 30,000 generations of technology without innovation. It's an extraordinary phenomenon when you think about it. And right next to it sits this object, which is exactly the same shape and size, and serves roughly the same purpose. In other words, I use it to execute my needs. And it's, of course, 5 years old, and it's out of date already. And it's this concept of innovation, this perpetual change, that I think is key to understanding human evolution. Now, there is a big difference between these two objects as well. One is made from a single substance. The other is made from a confection of different substances, indeed from different ideas. The idea of plastic, the idea of metal, the idea of computing, the idea of the laser, they've all occurred to different people in different places at different times, and yet they've been embodied together in this object. And that, I think, is the key to understanding why human technology can raise living standards, because it brings together ideas effectively to meet and to mate, or as I put it, it allows ideas to have sex. Every technology we use, when you think about it, is a combination of other technologies, other ideas. The pill camera is my favorite example. It takes a picture of your insides as it goes through. It came about after a conversation between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. Why did this happen to us, and why now? Why to the human species, and why in the last 100,000 years or so? What's so special about this moment in the long now? I don't think the answer for explaining the human takeoff of the last 100,000 years is culture, because chimpanzees have culture. They teach each other how to crack nuts with rocks. They pass down traditions. I don't think it's self-awareness. It's clear that all sorts of other animals have at least budding self-awareness. And I don't think it's language, because now that we've looked at the genes of Neanderthals, we've discovered that they had the same genetic adaptations to or from language that we have, the FOXP2 mutation in particular. And we know that the split from the Neanderthals happened at least 400,000 years ago. So what is it? What was the trigger that changed human behavior to this perpetual innovation machine? If you look at the size of the human brain over the last few million years, and you plot on this where things happened that we think of as distinctly human, they kind of all come too early to explain our takeoff. We were standing on two legs at least 4 million years ago. So we freed our hands, which we think is an important thing. We invented tools 2.5 million years ago, and yet, as I said, with the Australian hand axe, nothing really happened. We just had tools. We didn't encounter innovation. We invented fire, we don't know when, sometime between 500,000 and 1.5 million years ago. It had an enormous impact because it enabled us to pre-digest our food, and that meant we could have smaller guts, and that meant we could have bigger brains. But it's not immediately clear that it was the thing that triggered takeoff. And even language, as I say, we don't know when it happened, but it looks like it comes too early in the story to explain this extraordinary takeoff. What I think explains human explosion into global dominance is the invention of exchange, the invention of the idea that you swap one thing for another. And no other animal does this. Other animals do reciprocity. You scratch my back, I scratch yours, but they don't swap different things at the same time. They might occasionally do it between a mated pair where sex is swapped for food in various insects and birds, but the general idea that strangers would go up to each other and swap things. I've got more of this than I need, you've got more of that than you need, let's swap them. It doesn't happen in other species. As Adam Smith famously said, no man ever saw a dog make fair and deliberate exchange of a bone with another dog. And the effect this had on cultural evolution was exactly the same, I think, as the effect that the invention of sex had on biological evolution. Because the invention of sex accelerated and made cumulative for the first time genetic mutation and evolution. Here's an example. In an asexual species, as it's evolving along, you get two different mutations, a red one and a green one. One of them has to go extinct to make way for the other one if the other one's better, because you can only inherit a mutation from your direct lineage. Whereas in a sexual species, at some point an individual is going to inherit a mutation from both mutations, from different parents. And if they're both good mutations, then it can accumulate them. It can get different mutations onto the same, into the same individual. So what sex does is it allows the species to draw upon the genetic inventiveness of the whole species, not just its own lineage. And exchange has the same impact on human culture. Because of exchange, because of trade, we can draw upon the inventiveness of people in San Francisco and Shanghai at the same time. Now, I want to step back a little first and just talk about whether or not human beings are better off now than they have been before, and to try and persuade you that they are. And then I'm going to come back to this process of ideas having sex to explain why. Well, we're obviously producing more goods and services in the world. This is world product, corrected for inflation. But of course, there are more of us, so you'd expect that. So let's correct it for population and throw the graph back 2,000 years instead of 200 years. And it's still pretty spectacular with an inflection point at the Industrial Revolution. Let's go even further back. Let's go back 1 million years, where admittedly the economic data gets a little sketchy. And we can see that it looks like the growth rate of world GDP per capita is increasing. In other words, there's an acceleration of GDP per capita going on. And just look at the numbers we're heading for here. $100,000 to $200,000 per head globally in today's dollars before the end of this century. That's the trajectory we're on, that our grandchildren will have an income 3 to 6 times as high as the average American today, globally all around the world. Those are amazing numbers, if they can be sustained. So it's very interesting, I think, to understand whether or not this is possible. What about recessions? We know all about them. They're horrible and they're painful, and we're in one at the moment. But if you look on the long scale, as I think the Long Now Foundation likes one to do, then they don't, on the whole, make that much difference. If you look, here's the Great Depression in American GDP, and here's the Great Recession. And what's striking about the graph is not the dips, but the inexorable increase in GDP per capita in between. And it's not at the expense, it's not just rich people getting rich, at the expense of poverty. Poverty's declining. There are many ways of measuring it. This is one of them, people living on less than a constant $1990 a year, as measured by Javier Salah y Martin. And this is not what most people think. This is not what the world leaders signed up to at Rio in 1992. They said, we're confronted with a worsening of poverty. No, they weren't. Poverty was declining at the time, and it's still declining. It's even declining in Africa now. It wasn't in the 1980s and 1990s, but it's now declining pretty rapidly. Africa had 5.5% economic growth last year. Many environmentalists still haven't got that message and think that it's not possible to get Africa out of poverty. I think they're wrong. I actually think that we will see Africa following Asia into increasing prosperity in years to come. But of course, money isn't the only measure of how well off you are. What really counts, the real metric of prosperity, is time. How long does it take you to fulfill one of your needs? If you had to get up in the morning and supply yourself with food and clothing and shelter and entertainment and all that, it would take you a long time to supply each of those needs. How long do you actually need to work to fulfill one of those needs today? Let's take electric light. If you want to read a book by the light of an 18-watt compact fluorescent bulb for an hour this evening, and I hope it's mine, then how long would you have had to work if you're on the average wage? And the answer is about half a second. Back in 1950, you'd have had to work for 8 seconds on the average wage to earn that much light from an incandescent bulb. That's 7.5 seconds of economic growth, which has appeared in the world since then. 7.5 seconds that you can now spend earning something else, or if you're my children, leaving the light on. And back in 1880, you'd have had to work for 15 minutes to earn that much light from a kerosene lamp. In 1800, the average person would have had to work for 6 hours to acquire that much light in the form of a tallow candle. The average person in 1800 could not afford a candle. That's the real measure, the reduction in the amount of time you have to spend to fulfill a need or a demand. And how is that possible? Well, in the end, it's due to technology. But why does technology help? It helps essentially because of this: comparative advantage. The only proposition, it has once been said, in the whole of the social sciences that is both true and surprising. David Ricardo, a London stockbroker, came up with this idea basically in 1817, and he was trying to explain why it's worth a country trading with another country, even if it's worse than that other country at producing everything. And here's his explanation in Stone Age terms. There are two men sitting around a fire, and they need a spear and an axe to go out hunting. Adam is rather slow at making both spears and axes. Oz is faster at making both. But Oz is slightly better at spears, and Adam is slightly better at axes. So Oz doesn't need Adam, does he? He should just make a spear and an axe and leave Adam and go off hunting. Well, no, because if Oz were to make 2 spears and Adam were to make 2 axes, and then they were to trade, then they would each have saved an hour of work, because Oz would have worked for 2 hours instead of 3, and Adam would have worked for 6 hours instead of 7. And of course, this is only true because Oz is better at spears and Adam is better at axes. But if you think about it, if they're trading, then that's bound to be true, because Oz is going to get more practice at making spears and Adam at making axes. And so the more they exchange, the more they're going to specialize, and the more they specialize, the more value there is in exchange. It's a sort of perpetual motion machine that builds up. If they work for each other, they can raise each other's standard of living. So if you go back to this image and you ask yourself who made the objects, the axe was made by someone for himself. The mouse was made by a team of people for me. They got together one day and they said, Matt Ridley needs a computer mouse, let's make him one. How many of them were in that team? There were hundreds, thousands. I think there were probably